When a nation falls, the sea turns wild. When Somalia collapsed in the early 1990s, the world barely noticed, but the ocean did. A nation without a government is like a coastline without a lighthouse. The darkness spreads, quietly, until it touches everything. What had once been a functioning state, fragile, yes, but still standing, shattered overnight. Ministries vanished, police disappeared, and most importantly, the Somali Coast Guard ceased to exist. And when a coastline loses its guardians, predators always arrive. First came the foreign fishing fleets, massive industrial trawlers from Europe and Asia, slicing through Somali waters like steel giants. They dragged nets the size of buildings, scooping away tuna, lobster, shark, and everything in between. Local fishermen, already struggling to survive, watched their nets come up empty. Their boats, small, wooden, hand-built, were no match for billion-dollar vessels. But it wasn't just overfishing. Toxic waste, barrels of chemical sludge, and even medical waste began appearing along Somali shores, dumped illegally by companies who knew no one was watching. Children got sick. Villages complained of strange smells. Fish floated dead near beaches. And the world still didn't look. In these conditions, desperation reshaped ordinary men. Fishermen who once lived simple lives, catching enough to feed their families, found themselves pushed to the edge. They did not wake up wanting to become pirates. They were forced into the sea by hunger, by anger, by a world that ignored their suffering. So the first pirates weren't criminals. They were patrols. Young men armed with nothing more than worn-out rifles began confronting illegal ships. They boarded them, demanded compensation, and called themselves Coast Guards of Somalia. For a brief moment, they believed they were defending their home, protecting waters that no one else cared about. But when money began to flow in, first as fines, then as ransoms, the line between protector and outlaw began to blur. Somalia had fallen, and the sea, once wild but fair, turned into something much darker, a place where desperate men could become both heroes and monsters, depending on who told the story. Foreign ships invade Somali waters. The collapse of Somalia didn't just leave the land ungoverned, it left the sea abandoned. And the world, seeing a coastline with no laws and no patrols, did what it often does when no one is watching. It took advantage. From the horizon, steel shadows began to appear. Enormous trawlers from Europe and Asia pushed into Somali waters as if they belonged there. These weren't small fishing vessels, they were floating factories, each one capable of catching more fish in a single day than an entire Somali village could catch in a month. Their nets dug into the deep like claws. They scraped coral, dragged the seabed, swallowed entire schools of fish. Even sharks, once the rulers of the Indian Ocean, were caught in their massive nets, left to rot before being tossed overboard. For Somali fishermen, it was a nightmare. They woke before dawn, pushed their wooden boats out into the surf, cast their nets, and pulled back nothing. The sea that had fed them for generations was being emptied right in front of their eyes. They complained to whoever would listen. No one did. But the worst crime didn't float on the surface. It sank. Late at night, under moonless skies, rusted cargo ships crept toward the Somali coast, carrying something far more dangerous than fishing gear: toxic waste. Barrels of chemicals, used medical supplies, heavy metals, poisons the world didn't want to deal with, were dumped offshore, rolling into the deep like forgotten secrets. The ocean changed. Strange illnesses appeared along the beaches. Fishermen found discolored water. Children developed rashes after swimming. One storm washed dozens of sealed barrels onto the sand, labeled with hazard symbols and warnings no one could read. Somali villagers brought the problem to global organizations, pleading for help, for justice, for someone to hold the dumpers accountable. But the reports were ignored, buried in paperwork, lost in the noise of larger nations' concerns. And so the anger grew. Imagine a coastline where the fish are disappearing, the water is poisoned, and the world shrugs its shoulders. Imagine being told to survive in a place where survival itself is being stolen from you. This is what the Somali fishermen saw: invaders taking their food, their livelihood, even their children's future. To them, piracy didn't begin as crime. It began as resistance. And soon, young men who once cast fishing nets would pick up second-hand rifles instead, not to attack the world, but to defend the only thing they had left, the sea itself. When the fish disappeared, so did their future. For generations, the people of Somalia lived by the rhythm of the sea. Fathers taught their sons how to tie nets, how to read the waves, how to follow the silent trails of fish beneath the turquoise water. The ocean wasn't just a resource, it was identity, tradition, and survival woven together. But then, one morning, the rhythm broke. A fisherman named Abshir pushes his wooden skiff into the dawn-lit water. He casts his nets like his father once did, practiced, precise, hopeful. Hours pass. The sun climbs high. Sweat drips from his brow as he hauls the nets back in. They're empty. He returns the next day. Empty. A week later. Still empty. Soon, it's not just Abshir. Entire villages begin returning from the sea with nothing but torn nets and hollow eyes. Their children sit waiting on the shore for fish that never come. Mothers stretch what little flour they have into thin, tasteless bread. Men who once brought home baskets of catch now stare into the waves wondering what they did wrong. But they did nothing wrong. Foreign super trawlers had taken almost everything the sea once offered. They swept the coast clean with industrial nets miles long. The fish had not moved. They had been stolen. And with them, so too was Somalia's last lifeline. Before the collapse of the government, fishermen could always rely on the ocean even when the land failed. Drought, war, inflation, they still had fish. Even during the worst years, the sea kept communities alive. But now, that safety was gone. Unemployment in coastal villages rises to nearly 80%. Markets that once overflowed with tuna, snapper, and lobster now display only imported rice and cheap canned food, if they display anything at all. Children leave school to help their families survive. Young men drift through the streets with no work, no hope, and no clear future. The sea, their childhood playground, feels like a graveyard. And then the whispers begin. Why should foreign ships take everything? Where is justice for our people? If no one protects us, we must protect ourselves. The older fishermen hesitate. They dream of a return to normalcy, to peaceful nets and calm waves. But the younger generation, raised amid war and hunger, sees no choice. They watch their families starve while factory ships haul away millions of dollars worth of fish just kilometers offshore. Desperation hardens into resolve. And it is in this moment, on these beaches, among these empty nets, that the seed of piracy takes root. Not out of greed, not out of villainy, but out of a simple, painful truth. When survival is taken away, people fight for what remains. The fishermen who lose their livelihood today will become the men who board ships tomorrow, not as criminals in their eyes, but as defenders of a sea stolen from them. They didn't call themselves pirates. They called themselves protectors. Before the world labeled them pirates, the men on Somalia's coast had another name for themselves. Bada Defakayasha, defenders of the sea. The Western media would one day paint them as villains, outlaws, and threats to global trade. But in the beginning, in their own eyes, they were something very different. They were the Coast Guard their country no longer had. It started quietly. A group of young fishermen gathered on a beach near Aden. Their fathers had already lost boats to collisions with foreign trawlers. Their nets had been dragged away like trash. Their families were starving, watching the horizon for fish that were never coming back. One night, under the glow of lanterns, they speak not about crime, but about protection. If no government will guard our waters, says one, then we must guard them ourselves. If they steal our fish, says another, we will make them pay. Not for revenge, the oldest insists, for survival. They begin small. A handful of fishermen borrow rifles left behind from decades of civil war. Old AK-47s rusted by salt air. They fix metal plates to the sides of their boats for makeshift protection. They repaint their skiffs with dark tar to blend with the sea at night. Nothing high-tech, nothing luxurious. Just desperation engineered into resistance. The first confrontation is not an attack. It is a warning. A massive illegal trawler drags its nets just a few kilometers off the coast, scooping everything in its path. The fishermen approach in their small wooden boats, waving handmade flags and shouting through cracked megaphones. "These waters are Somali! Stop fishing here!" The trawler ignores them. So they fire warning shots into the air, loud cracks echoing over the waves, not toward the crew, not to harm, but to be heard. The trawler leaves. For the first time in months, the villagers feel a spark of hope. Soon, word spreads along the entire coastline. Fishermen from Ale, Haradheri, Hobyo, and Bosaso begin organizing themselves into patrol groups. They monitor the waters, they chase away factory ships, they approach captains and demand small payments to allow safe passage, what they believe is rightfully owed for violating their territory. This is the beginning of piracy, but it does not yet resemble the hijackings the world would come to fear. There are no hostage takings, no millions in ransom. At this stage, their actions look more like taxation, protection, or reclaiming stolen waters. They justify every dollar collected as compensation for environmental destruction. They see themselves as guardians, not criminals. Some even keep detailed logs, names of illegal vessels, locations of foreign fleets, amounts of fish taken from Somali waters. These early pirate leaders patrol with the discipline of a government force, men who grew up on the sea using the only skill they know, navigation by instinct. But international media doesn't see starving fishermen taking justice into their own hands. They see armed men on boats. And they use a single word: pirates. That label will change everything. Because as soon as the world calls them pirates, the world will treat them like pirates. And a defensive movement born out of hunger will soon morph into something far more dangerous, shaped by global attention, foreign navies, and the pressures of a collapsing nation. But here, in the beginning, they are not the villains of the story. They are simply men fighting for the waters that once fed them. Where there is chaos, someone always profits. For a brief moment, the Coast Guards of Somalia believed they had restored a sliver of order to their broken world. They chased away illegal ships, protected fishing villages, and collected small fines to sustain their people. But in a collapsed nation, where government, law, and justice were all long dead, power never stays in the hands of the weak for long. Word traveled fast across Somalia's scarred landscape. Men from the coast are making money. Foreign ships are paying them. The sea is now a business, and wherever whispers of money echo, the warlords soon follow. These warlords were not mythical monsters. They were products of the Civil War, men who rose to power when institutions fell. They controlled roads, ports, neighborhoods, even entire clans. And now, they turned their eyes to the sea. At first, they approached the fishermen politely, offering protection from rival clans. They brought fuel for boats, new motors, radios, and weapons, things the fishermen desperately needed. They promised stability, structure, safety, but their help came with a price. "What you earn," one warlord commander said calmly. "You will share with us. We will ensure your patrols continue." A polite way of saying, "We own you now." Suddenly, the sea was no longer a place of simple resistance. It became territory, controlled, taxed, and militarized. Pirate groups that had once been small teams of fishermen were absorbed into larger clan-based organizations. The skiffs were no longer patched and worn. They were now upgraded with GPS systems, bigger engines, and heavier weapons. And with these changes came a shift in purpose. The warlords didn't want to chase illegal fishing boats. They wanted the big prize, foreign cargo ships. Ships carrying oil, electronics, food, and machinery. Ships worth hundreds of millions. Ships with crews from every corner of the world. Ships with owners willing to pay ransom to bring them home safely. The fishermen-turned-guardians hesitated. "This is not why we started," some argued. "We were protecting our waters, not attacking innocent people. We do not want to become criminals." But the warlords didn't ask for their permission. They demanded their obedience. And the fishermen had families. They had no government to turn to, no jobs to fall back on. Refusing meant hunger, exile, or worse. Accepting meant survival. So the transformation began. The Coast Guards became pawns in a larger system. The skiffs multiplied. Training became harsher. Operations became more organized. A warlord in Haradheri built what many later called a pirate stock exchange. a place where investors funded missions and took shares of the ransom. A captured ship became a months-long economy. Cooks, guards, negotiators, fuel suppliers, all earning a living from the hostages anchored offshore. And the fishermen? They were lost somewhere in the middle. No longer heroes, not yet villains. Just men caught in the gears of a machine far bigger than their original cause. Warlords had turned a desperate struggle for survival into an industrial business. What began as a defense of Somali waters was now evolving into global piracy, and the world was about to notice. It started with warnings, then escalated into history. The first hijacking did not feel like history in the making. It felt like a mistake. A moment when desperation, luck, and opportunity collided on a calm blue sea. By now, the Coast Guards had changed. The warlords had armed them, funded them, and pushed them toward bigger prey. But the men on the boats were still the same former fishermen. Nervous, conflicted, unsure whether they were crossing a line they could never return from. It begins with a rusted merchant ship drifting peacefully near the Somali coast. Far too close, in the eyes of the locals. For years, illegal trawlers had stolen their fish, polluted their water, and rammed their boats without apology. So when the lookout spots the cargo vessel shimmering on the horizon, his voice cracks. Another foreign ship, too big to be fishing. Why is it here? The warlord-appointed commander sees opportunity. This one will pay, he says. Approach. But the fishermen hesitate. They remember the early days, when they only confronted trawlers, when they fired warning shots into the air, not at people, when they believed they were doing something righteous. This isn't the same, one mutters. This ship is innocent. But hunger drowns morality. A sick mother, an empty fridge, a collapsed economy, a village relying on a single successful mission. These things weigh heavier than guilt. So they move. Their small skiffs bounce over the waves, engines roaring, the smell of salt and diesel thick in the air. They fire warning shots, not into the sky this time, but near the ship's bow. The cargo vessel panics, slows, and tries to change direction. But it's too late. The fishermen-turned gunmen latch onto the hull with ladders. Their hearts are pounding, hands shaking, not from excitement, but from fear. This isn't a hunt. This isn't revenge. This is survival wearing the mask of crime. The crew is terrified but unharmed. The pirates shout instructions in broken English. Stop engine! Sit! No problem! Repeating the only words they know to keep the situation calm. Their goal is not to hurt anyone. Their goal is simply to get paid and go home alive. When the ship is anchored offshore, negotiations begin. No one expects it to work. Not the pirates, not the warlords, not even the insurance companies halfway across the world. But after weeks of tense bargaining, something unimaginable happens. Money arrives. Not small money. Not compensation for stolen fish, but hundreds of thousands of dollars, more than any fisherman had earned in a lifetime. The men who once caught tuna for a few dollars a day now handle sums that could rebuild entire villages. Hospitals, wells, schools. Possibilities open like floodgates. And in that moment, everything changes. The warlords smile. Investors circle like vultures. Young men from inland towns rush to the coast, eager to join. And foreign ships, once invisible, now look like floating treasure chests. But for the original fishermen, the victory feels hollow. They sit quietly on the beach after the ransom pays out, staring at the waves. They know they've crossed a threshold. What started as defending their waters has now become something darker, something profitable, something addictive. One man whispers almost to himself. In a broken country, ransom becomes an industry. When the first ransom finally reached the shores of Aden, it didn't feel like dirty money. It felt like a miracle. Not because anyone wanted to celebrate crime, but because Somalia had been living without an economy for nearly 2 decades. Schools were abandoned, hospitals barely functioned, markets were empty. People survived on hope, prayer, and whatever the ocean still had left to give. So when a group of fishermen returned with more money than the entire village had seen in years, everything changed, slowly at first, then like a flood. The men who were once mocked as boat boys suddenly became the providers. Entire families who used to depend on a single daily catch could now afford food for months. Children who had never tasted soda were suddenly drinking it from cold glass bottles. Shops that had been closed since the Civil War reopened their doors, brushing away dust that had settled like a funeral shroud. In Somalia, a nation where the government had collapsed, banks didn't function, and jobs were a memory, the ransom money acted like fuel inside a dead engine. And that engine roared back to life. New businesses sprang up everywhere. Mechanics began repairing the pirates' skiffs. Restaurants offered hot meals to crews waiting for negotiations. Tailors stitched new clothing for men returning successful from the sea. Hotels, some nothing more than concrete rooms with plastic chairs, were suddenly fully booked. Entire trading routes formed to supply fuel, engines, spare parts, and food for missions. People called it the pirate economy, not because they admired it, but because it was the only economy that existed. Even the elders who disapproved of hijackings could not ignore the truth. Pirate money paid for things the government never did. Wells were dug. Mosques were repaired. Some villages built small clinics with medicines bought using ransom funds. For the first time in decades, money flowed. Not from aid organizations, not from foreign donors, but from the sea. But this prosperity was not evenly shared. Warlords and financiers, usually hiding behind clan politics, took large portions. They invested in weapons, faster engines, new radios, navigation devices, and safe houses. Young men from inland towns who had never seen the ocean in their lives rushed to the coast in search of pirate jobs. Some acted as guards, others became cooks, translators, negotiators, or lookouts perched on cliffs with binoculars. This wasn't just crime. It became an industry with employees, investors, and infrastructure. Yet beneath the sudden wealth, something darker grew. Villagers worried that their sons were becoming too entangled with armed groups. Mothers feared that a mission gone wrong could mean death or jail in a foreign country. Religious leaders warned that money earned from crime carries a curse. Even the pirates themselves felt a silent heaviness. Deep down, many knew this wasn't the life they wanted. But for a country abandoned by the world, morality became complicated. How do you tell a starving family to reject the only income that can keep them alive? How do you blame a village for accepting money when the alternative is hunger? Somalia was caught between two realities: the dignity of honest living and the desperation of survival in a nation without a future. The pirate economy didn't rise because people loved crime. It rose because the world left them with nothing else. And as the money kept flowing, Somalia's coastline transformed, from quiet fishing villages into bustling hubs of activity. But with growth came attention. With attention came danger. And soon, global powers would turn their eyes toward Somalia and come with force. Behind every pirate is a desperate story. Before the world saw them as threats on the water, before news channels looped footage of skiffs chasing giant cargo ships, they were just boys, sons, brothers, fathers, born into a country that had forgotten how to give them a future. When journalists and aid workers later visited Somalia's pirate towns, Ale, Haradher, Hobyo, they didn't find monsters. They found humanity cracked by poverty. One reporter described a young pirate named Abshir. He was 19, thin, quiet. His hands trembled when he held his rifle, not from fear, but from hunger. When asked why he joined the pirates, he shrugged. "I didn't join, I survived." His father had been a fisherman before the illegal trawlers emptied their waters. His mother sold tea on a roadside stall. When famine hit their region, their youngest child died of malnutrition. Abshir remembers digging the grave with his bare hands. After that day, he said, he understood one truth. Starving is slow, piracy is dangerous, but at least piracy gives you a chance. Another man, Farah, once dreamed of becoming a teacher. He spoke English better than many of the negotiators. He had studied under a tree because the school building had been shelled during the Civil War. At 24, he joined a pirate group, not to hijack ships himself, but to act as a translator during ransom calls. He told interviewers, "If Somalia had a government, I would be a teacher. But Somalia has no schools, and my brothers need food." For many, piracy wasn't ambition. It was escape. The escape from drought, from unemployment, from hunger, from total collapse. A former fisherman named Molim explained it best. "We were not born with guns in our hands. The ocean fed us. When the foreigners took our fish, they left us no choice. What would you do if your family is hungry and your country is gone? These men weren't psychopaths. They weren't villains plotting world chaos. Most didn't even enjoy the hijackings. They simply endured them. Missions were long, dangerous, unpredictable. A single mistake could mean death from naval forces or drowning in the open sea. Some couldn't swim at all. A 17-year-old recruit once laughed bitterly during an interview. Imagine, pirates who can't swim. But that is my life. Many pirates carried old photos in their pockets, family portraits from happier times, pictures of children they hoped to send to school, images of wives waiting in broken homes. Between missions, they sat under the shade of makeshift huts, playing cards, sharing tea, telling stories of who they used to be before the war swallowed their futures. And then there were those who regretted everything. A man named Ibrahim, once part of a successful hijacking group, later left the trade entirely. He said, "Every time I pointed a gun at a ship, I felt like I was dying inside. But what choice did I have? I never wanted to harm anyone. I only wanted to feed my people." He now works for a local NGO, helping rehabilitate former pirates. He tells them the same thing he told himself. "You are not a criminal by nature. You are a man trapped in a bad time." These faces, these stories, are the part of piracy the world rarely sees. Because it is easier to condemn a pirate than to understand him. Easier to judge a gun than to understand the hand holding it. Easier to fear the hijacker than to recognize the hunger behind his eyes. Somali piracy wasn't born from evil. It was born from collapse. From abandonment. From a world that protected shipping lanes but ignored starving villages. This chapter of history isn't about villains or heroes. It's about men doing what they felt they had to do in a country with no safety net, no government, and no future. And soon, the world and its navies would come crashing into this fragile reality. When the sea became dangerous, the world sent warships. As the hijackings grew bolder and the ransoms climbed into the millions, the world's major shipping lanes began to choke with fear. Oil tankers, aid ships, merchant vessels, and fishing fleets all found themselves vulnerable to fast-moving skiffs armed with RPGs and old Soviet rifles. The global economy felt the shock. Every hijacking increased shipping insurance, slowed down trade routes, and pushed companies to reroute thousands of kilometers around Africa. What started as a local crisis in Somalia was suddenly an international emergency. That is when the world finally struck back. Countries that rarely agreed on anything, NATO states, the European Union, China, Russia, India, Japan, and even Iran, sent warships to the same boiling stretch of ocean. The Gulf of Aden, once a quiet corridor for commerce, transformed into one of the most militarized waters on the planet. Destroyers patrolled in tight grids, helicopters scanned the waves with night vision systems, and special forces teams trained for rapid hostage rescues. Naval commanders coordinated across languages and alliances, sharing intelligence and tracking suspicious boats as if they were hunting ghosts. Slowly, the balance began to shift. Pirate motherships found themselves intercepted before they could approach shipping lanes. Skiffs were chased off by warning shots. Some captured pirates were disarmed and released. Others faced prosecution in foreign courts. The message was clear. The world was no longer watching from the sidelines. It had drawn a line in the water, and for the first time, Somali pirates were no longer the only hunters in the sea. One hostage crisis put Somali piracy on every screen on Earth. In April 2009, the world woke up to a story that felt almost unreal. A massive American cargo ship, the Maersk, Alabama, had been boarded in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The pirates were young, some barely adults, armed with old rifles and desperation. But what they captured was no ordinary vessel. It was carrying humanitarian aid bound for Africa, and it flew the US flag. Overnight, the incident exploded across global media, turning Somali piracy from a distant headline into a gripping minute-by-minute drama watched by millions. Captain Richard Phillips and his crew fought back fiercely, disabling the ship and forcing the pirates to retreat. But not before they took Phillips hostage in a small, enclosed lifeboat drifting in open waters. For 5 tense days, the world watched as the orange pod bobbed under the brutal sun, surrounded by American warships and negotiators trying to prevent bloodshed. The pirates demanded millions. The US refused to back down. Then came one of the most decisive moments in modern naval history. Under the cover of darkness, Navy SEAL snipers from SEAL Team 6 positioned themselves on the USS Bainbridge, waiting for the perfect second, each trained to fire simultaneously. When the opportunity finally came, 3 shots rang out in the night, each striking its target with surgical precision. In a single heartbeat, Captain Phillips was pulled to safety, and the hostage crisis was over. The rescue electrified global audiences. News channels replayed the moment endlessly. Hollywood turned it into a major film. Governments cited it as proof that piracy had crossed a line the world would no longer tolerate. For many, the Maersk, Alabama was not just an incident. It was the defining image of a chaotic era, a real-life thriller that showed just how high the stakes in Somali waters had become. For every success they had, the risks grew larger. By the early 2010s, the golden age of Somali piracy was already cracking under its own weight. What began as small, desperate operations by former fishermen had transformed into a high-stakes battlefield, and the pirates were no longer the only ones adapting. International navies crowded the Gulf of Aden, drones patrolled the skies, and commercial ships armed themselves with private security teams. Suddenly, every hijacking attempt felt like a gamble with death. Pirate groups that once roamed freely now had to travel farther into the Indian Ocean to avoid patrols, sometimes hundreds of miles from the Somali coast. Their skiffs, never built for long journeys, capsized in storms. Engines failed. Fuel ran dry. Many never returned home, lost to the sea they once depended on. Mothers in coastal villages speak of sons who left to fight illegal fishing and simply never came back. Inside the pirate networks, tensions grew. Warlords demanded bigger cuts. Clans argued over ransoms. Young pirates complained of risking their lives while leaders sat safely on shore. Some groups turned on each other, raiding rival pirate camps or fighting over captured ships. The industry that once injected money into struggling towns now began tearing them apart. And then came the surveillance. Satellites tracked every suspicious vessel. Drones circled the water like silent shadows. For the first time, pirates felt hunted. What used to be easy targets, slow-moving cargo ships, were suddenly fortified with barbed wire, armed guards, high-pressure water cannons, and evasive maneuvers. Even successful boardings became rare, and failed attempts grew deadly. The message was clear. The world had changed, and the cost of piracy was rising faster than the reward. Young men who once saw piracy as a way to protect their villages or escape starvation began to realize they were stepping into a war they could never win. Many pirates didn't want to be pirates anymore. As international pressure increased and the dangers of hijacking grew deadlier, something unexpected began happening along Somalia's coast. Pirates started looking for a way out. For many, the dream of fast ransom money had collided with a harsh reality. Friends dying at sea, families living in fear, and entire communities caught between warlords and foreign navies. The same young men who once climbed onto skiffs with AK-47s now wished for something far simpler: a safe life, steady work, and dignity. Former pirates interviewed by journalists and NGOs often repeated the same line: "If we had fish, we would have never touched guns." And so, efforts began to rebuild what had been lost years earlier when illegal trawlers emptied Somali waters. NGOs, local leaders, and international organizations launched programs to restore the fishing industry, providing new nets, boats, and cold storage facilities. For the first time in decades, fishermen could return to the sea with hope instead of anger. Some ex-pirates took jobs in these new projects, using their knowledge of the ocean to train younger fishermen. Others joined community watch groups, determined to keep foreign poachers and toxic dumpers away, legally this time. A few even spoke out publicly, warning youth about the curse of easy money. Villages that once relied on ransom cash slowly began shifting towards sustainable work: boat repair, small trade businesses, and cooperative fisheries. Mothers encouraged their sons to stay off the skiffs. Imams preached about peace and accountability. Even clan elders, once pressured by pirate bosses, now supported rebuilding livelihoods over risking lives. The transition wasn't perfect. Poverty remained, and temptation never fully disappeared. But the movement was real. Somalis reclaiming their coast, not with bullets, but with rebuilding. And for the first time in many years, the waters off Somalia began to feel less like a war zone and more like a place where life could start again. The Golden Age ended, not by force alone, but by change within Somalia. Somali piracy didn't collapse overnight. It faded slowly, crushed from the outside, yet transformed from within. By the early 2010s, the world's naval forces had turned the Gulf of Aden into one of the most heavily patrolled waterways on the planet. Warships from the US, EU, China, India, and dozens of nations formed a near-constant presence, escorting merchant vessels and eliminating the pirates' greatest weapon: surprise. Commercial ships armed themselves with barbed wire, armed guards, water cannons, and evasive maneuvers, making hijackings increasingly difficult and deadly. But these external pressures were only half the story. Inside Somalia, something far more important began to shift. As fishing cooperatives re-emerged and international aid helped restore local industries, young men finally had alternatives to picking up a rifle. Towns that once depended on ransom money started realizing piracy had brought danger, not prosperity. Schools reopened, small markets flourished, and coastal communities began functioning again with modest but stable income sources. Local authorities also stepped up. In Puntland and other regions, new anti-piracy laws were enforced. Corrupt warlords and pirate bosses lost influence as communities rejected their leadership. Former pirates who wanted out found ways to reintegrate through fishing programs, apprenticeships, and rebuilding efforts. Many even helped authorities identify remaining pirate hideouts, weakening the networks from the inside. By 2013, the number of successful hijackings had plummeted to near zero. The once feared pirate safe havens, Ale, Haradhara, Hobyo, transformed from bustling ransom hubs into quiet coastal towns struggling to redefine themselves. The pirate stock exchange disappeared, the flashy lifestyle faded, and the myth of easy money unraveled. In the end, piracy didn't die because the world sent warships. It died because Somalis slowly reclaimed their coastline, their livelihoods, and their future. They were never monsters, just men born into a storm. For decades, the world only saw the headlines: speedboats, AK-47s, and hijacked cargo ships. But behind every grainy photograph and dramatic news clip were men shaped by a lifetime of hardship: war, famine, lawlessness, and the slow death of their only livelihood. Now, as the waves of piracy recede, Somalia is left with a far greater challenge: rebuilding a nation and restoring dignity to its people. Many former pirates no longer see themselves as outlaws but as survivors, trying to escape the very cycle that pushed them toward the gun. In towns like Bosaso, Ale, and Garo, ex-pirates now work as fishermen, mechanics, shopkeepers, anything that lets them rewrite their stories. Some have become community leaders, speaking to young boys about the dangers of piracy, warning them that the quick money was never worth the years of fear, loss, and violence. International organizations help them transition back into normal life, offering fishing equipment, training programs, and microloans. Slowly, the coastline that once symbolized chaos now represents promise. Boats return from the sea, filled not with hostages, but with fresh catch. Markets buzz again. Children attend school without hearing gunfire echoing across the shore. But Somalia's path to redemption is not easy. The scars of conflict run deep, and rebuilding trust within communities and with the world takes time. Yet there is something unbreakable in the spirit of the Somali people. A belief that even after decades of turmoil, a new future is possible. Piracy was never the identity of Somalia. It was the symptom of a nation abandoned by the world and forgotten by its own leaders. Now, as the tide turns, Somalis are proving they are more than the narratives written about them. They are fishermen, fathers, dreamers, and survivors. And their redemption lies not in the barrels of guns, but in the quiet, determined rebuilding of their homeland. And as this chapter closes, one truth remains: nations don't heal through fear. They heal through opportunity, understanding, and hope. If you're interested in more powerful history stories with human depths, don't forget to subscribe.